So we can't go like crazy big and whatever. So the next part of that is going to be for production. So if we're doing something that's like going to be for a movie or a commercial or something where we really need some high-res textures, we're going to be really close to stuff, something like this kind of shot, we need to make sure those textures are crisp enough to see. Now, this one is neat because we're that close, but imagine that we had something like this where we had all of these gears and the engine block and all this stuff. We couldn't fit everything into one UV map and make it still look good and still have all that detail. So what we're going to do is I'm going to show you the process for taking more than one item and being able to separate it into different maps, okay, so that each one of these items basically can create its own map. So we're going to use a gear as our way to do this because it's pretty simple to model now in Maya and then pretty easy to see that process. So there's actually, under the polygon menu, there is a gear. And there's a gear. So that's like the easiest thing we need to model. I'm actually going to make a project window before I get any further so I don't forget. So this is going to be production pipeline. There we go. Okay. Everything, just like before, still stands. We lay out the UVs the same way. We model stuff pretty much the same way. We are going to add some more bevels. We are going to add some more detail to things. But we always want to maintain the least amount of polygons as possible. Push it down. There you go. So something like this, wherever we have these straight areas, it's very easy for us to get rid of those straight areas so that we don't have wasted polygons, okay? Because thinking about our UV layout, we don't want to have to grab all those faces and stitch them together. The less faces we have, the easier it's going to be. So on this gear, I'm going to go over to the inputs for it, and I can take away the height divisions. There they are. And so now those are gone. I can play with the internal radius. I can play with the gear spacing. I can play with the gear offset and the gear tips and the gear middles, and then even twisting or tapering the gear. Okay, so just with this one item, there's a lot of stuff that we can do to make this, kind of a customized gear. For the first one, I'm just going to keep it simple and go with something pretty much like that. Right? So now what I want to do is I'm just going to scale this in a bit. Is I want this to be nice and smooth, okay? If I go hit 3, that looks ugly. That doesn't look good. I want to add bevels all around this thing, okay? Now it'll be easier if I lay out my UVs, then add bevels, and then tweak the UVs after, okay? Because otherwise I have a lot more faces and edges that I have to select in order for that whole process to happen. So I'm going to lay out the UVs for this. Now based on what we talked about before, all of our shapes we should try to break down into basically cylinders if we can. With this, it's going to be no different. We're going to still try to break this down into cylinders and flat areas. So looking at the gear, I see the top faces and the bottom faces right there at the top and right there on the bottom as ones that are just flat. And then I see everything else as basically a cylinder that can unwrap as one piece. Okay? Now all the gears will be pretty much the same thing. So just so we can see this process work, I'm going to turn on my UVs. There they are. And the cool thing about their default setup is that they already come in with a pretty good setup. Like the top of the gear and the bottom of the gear are already separated. The outside of the gear and the inside of the gear are also already separated. So all I really have to do, if I turn on my checkerboard, you can see these are squished, these are square. Freeze transforms, just like before, that's not different. And then grab everything and unfold it. Okay, so default gear is pretty easy to do. When we start twisting it, it may get a little bit more complex. When we start tapering it or any of that, it gets a little bit more complex. Now looking at the size of this, let me turn off my checkerboard again. You can definitely see how big this piece is, how small that piece is, and then these two pieces here. We always want to maintain as high of a resolution as we can. So if I go here and I do my layout, these settings are exactly the same. None of the unfold settings change. None of the layout settings change. I created under Create Polygon Gear. So that's how it lays it out by default. Okay? Now, was that? If your UVs come messed up, it's the same process, okay? So I'm going to show you how the defaults come in. I'm going to show you how we basically relay them out if they get screwed up. So with something like this, you can see obviously I'm not maximizing my UV space here. So I would definitely want to, obviously straighten this out so that it is perfectly straight up and down or left and right or whatever. But I also want to cut it into pieces. And so I may cut it, let's say there, and just for speed's sake, in these 3 spots, because that will give me more area to lay out my UVs. Okay, because the game still is fill this square. We still want that square to be as maximized as possible in order to make sure that we're getting the most detail in each one of our textures. If I brought this into Substance right now and I tried to do anything to it, any like painting I did, anything would just be so low res you wouldn't be able to see it. You wouldn't even be able to get close to this thing. Okay. All right. So that's better, but definitely not perfect. Okay. So let's pretend that our UVs come in just shot, just nothing on them. So just to show you what shot UVs might look like, I'm going to do automatic. There we go. Right, so here are some crazy UVs laid out. You can see that I have the top still, I have the bottom still, and then I have all these random pieces, okay? Even worse UVs than this would be, let's say I did spherical. Now all of this is under one thing. It looks like it's, nice and organized, but if I turn on my checkerboard, they're just going to be like disgusting out here, okay? So here's how I would lay this out from scratch, okay? The first thing I want to do is, just like it had, I want to isolate the areas that are perfectly flat. So the top and the bottom. The top is perfectly flat, the bottom is perfectly flat. So if I take those and do a planar map, tell it to go from the Y direction, that lays out these 2 items. Okay, now they default, they're on top of each other. Now they're next to each other, okay? Now all it leaves is this. Now this, if we were to look at it, it looks like it's, you could look at it and say maybe this is a lot of planar maps to get this thing lined up. It works really well if you just do a cylindrical mapping, okay? So I'm going to just do a cylindrical mapping on this. I'm going to ignore any of the stuff that it does out here because I know that it laid it out good. And then I'm just going to grab my pieces and then do an unfold, then do an orient, then do a layout. And what I should get is I should get the same-ish thing that I had before I did any of the other stuff. Okay, so there's my top, there's my bottom, there's the long side, there's the short side. Okay. No?
Like the cylindrical part for me is just a little stretched wide.
Did you freeze transforms?
Yes, it is.
It's not thin? All right, just give me a sec. All right, so now I'm going to come through and I'm going to cut it every other one. And that one's good, so I'm going to cut, grab all my pieces. The unfolding shouldn't really do anything because it's already unfolded, and then just do a layout. Yeah. So the process for the next step is not going to change. Now, watch what happens. Let's say I duplicate this thing. We still have to do the bevel and all that, but just so you can see this before we get more complicated. Let's say I duplicate this and I have an entire gear set up here, right? The impossible gears that will never actually work. As I take all of these pieces and then I go to my UV editor, and then I try to do a layout on these. all of these pieces obviously are going to get smaller because we have more pieces in there. We're trying to fit more stuff in there, okay? So far we've been using this top right quadrant. We can go further than the top right quadrant, okay? Unreal doesn't like to do it. It can, there's ways around it, but the easy way to do it is just to keep it simple in Unreal. For production stuff, we typically need to go above that. Now we can't see it, but this grid right here is exactly gridded here and here and here, and it goes on like, I think it's 10 this way and 10 that way, or 20 this way, more than we need. So under View, I'm going to go to my grid settings. So View, Grid, option box. And I'm going to say that I want my grid to be, let's say, 5 units. And I'm going to turn off my subdivision lines. I don't think I need those. I want to make my tile lines a different color, maybe red, that's good. And then I'll just hit apply. I don't think I like those settings. Let's see what else we can do. Let's get rid of grid lines. Oops, let's get rid of grid lines. There we go. I'll make grid lines every 1 unit. That's perfect. There we go. So my length and width is 5. My grid lines are 1. Subdivisions are 2, which is fine. I don't think it's subdivided anything there. And then I have my tile line set to a color red. And you can also turn on tile labels if you would like to turn on tile labels. Okay. Now the way that Maya has this set up, even though this is a grid that goes crazy to the right and crazy up and down and crazy left and crazy whatever, we can only use the positive directions, okay? So I can only put stuff in here, 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 and so on upwards. Nothing can go below this area. Nothing can go to the left of that area, okay? It just doesn't work. And you can tell that too based on the numbers. So this is U1V1. This is U2V1. Back here, these are negative. So this is U -1. And this down here is U -1, V -1. Okay? So UV, this is the U and V. U goes left and right. V goes up and down. Right? So that's what those U and V are referring to. So now watch how I can then take this. And if I go to Unfold, or I go to Layout, I can distribute this among tiles. So I can say distribute this 5 and 5. And so what this will do is it'll take all of these gears and it'll distribute them amongst all the tiles that are around. Now again, I'm not going to do this yet for my final one because I still need to do all my bevels. But I want you to see it before I do the bevels because that'll just make it take longer. Now, a disadvantage of doing it the way that I'm showing it here is that as it's distributing these, it may put like all the center pieces in one block and all the round pieces in another block and all the long pieces in another block. We don't typically want to do this because now our surface will be broken up among different blocks. So we may have textures for this item on several different things, and that's typically not what we want to do for something like this. If you looked at a character, what that is, character UV map. Okay, so this is a single gaming character UV map dropped on one. If this was for a movie and they needed the high-res texture like the Hulk, his face might be broken up over 10 different tiles. That's how detailed each one of those pieces are. Because each section of his face may be a 4K tile. So Maya is still thinking back there. Let's see if we can find one. Yeah. Right? So here's a good example. So here are some parts here, more parts, more parts, more parts, and more parts. Now none of the things can be overlapping a tile. So if our tile is just a square image, I can't have a UV sticking over that line of the tile. It has to be fully inside of it, okay? Because that way we don't have any weird stuff going on. It literally won't work. This is taking longer than I thought. So now we're back. All right, so now it broke up all of my stuff between a 5x5 tile. And you can see this still isn't really optimizing it because, there's a lot of wasted space here, a lot of wasted space there. So even though I can spread this out over a 5x5 tile, it makes actually more sense for me to lay out one in a nice gridded area and then move that one over to a specific spot, okay? Now it may look too that these are overlapping this grid, but if I were to zoom in, you'll see that it's definitely not overlapping right there. You can see that there's a space between where these two things are, okay? And that red line is my grid. All right, so let me delete all the other ones except for the first one. Oops, except for the first one. There we go. All right, so now I'm going to add my bevels to that very first gear. And this is why it's easier to do it this way, because once I add my bevels to this, it's simply a matter of going back to the UV editor and then tweaking these UVs that are already laid out perfectly. Okay, so I'm going to go to edge. Now, just like before, our goal is to select everything that is square. Okay, now this process is going to take forever if I do it this way. And I have a huge risk of not grabbing the right faces or edges. Okay, so I don't want to do it this way because that literally will take me forever to do. So I'm going to go to select. I'm going to go to use constraints. And in here, I'm going to make sure I grab all my edges, like I'm grabbing all of them. And I'm going to go to my geometry. I'm going to go to angle. And I'm going to set my max angle to like 140 and my min angle to like, 50. I'm going to activate it and say current and next. Okay, so I set my max angle to 144, something bigger than 90. I think that's probably a good number. If it's not, I'll lower it and it'll adjust. Same thing with the min. I'm going below 90, and then I try to find a sweet spot. This is the sweet spot for this, and I'll show you what I mean by that. If you look here, what it's doing is anywhere there's a 90-degree turn from one face to another face, that edge is at a 90-degree angle for those two faces, so it selects it. In some spots, it's not a 90-degree angle. So like right here where it's turning this area, that's probably not a 90-degree angle. It's probably a little bit more than 90. Now I can see that if I lower this max number. So let's say I set the max number right to 90. Okay, looks like everything is still selected. I'll set the minimum number to 90 as well. Right? So now that I've set the min and the max to 90, you'll see that these ones didn't get selected. Okay? So that's why I set this one down so low, 45, and then this one up so high, 145, is it grabs all the stuff that I need.
So you wanted to grab that little corner spot or not?
I do, yes.
Okay.
Anywhere it's a sharp transition, I want it to grab it. Okay? Now if I go down too low, it'll grab everything, right? And I go up too high, same thing, okay? My marquee. You can see now it grabbed all these inner ones. That's a bad thing. I don't want to grab all the inner ones, right? Now the way that this works is, let me lower this down to 45. If I already have it selected like this, and I start playing with those numbers, it will subtract stuff from my selection, but it won't add stuff to it, okay? And what I mean by that is, let's say I set this to 101, and I said, whoops, that number's not right, and then I reset it back to 45, it's not going to reselect all the ones that are on here. I have to do the reselection. All this thing is limits what I can select, okay? Now that could be a dangerous thing because if I close this window and I go back to my edges, you'll see that it's only going to let me select edges or faces. Well, the faces are all that, but all the edges that are just that selection. Okay, so it remembers those settings that I had set in there. Okay, so once I have all those edges selected on the tops around here, I can just say close and reset. And that window now goes back to what it was. Now I can just add my bevel. Okay, so I'm going to add a slight bevel here, maybe like 0.1 and 2 segments. That looks good. Okay, so now I have just a slight little bevel going around it. That looks sufficient. And now if I go to my UV editor, it automatically splits my stuff for me. So there's the UVs or there's the bevels right on it. And the same thing for the middle, there's the bevels. So now it's just a matter of grabbing all the pieces. Is that all of them? Yes, okay. And then doing an unfold, tweaked it a little bit, doing an orient, and then doing a layout. And this time I'm just going to lay it out at a 1 by 1. Oops, wrong spot. 1 by 1. Sweet.
How much did you bevel the edge?
0.1 and then 2 divisions. Now sometimes you can notice some, like if I moved that shell down to here, this might lay out just a little bit bigger. It won't be huge, but it might be a bit bigger. Remember, the idea here is that we want to have squares, have all the squares the same size, and then try to maximize this space as best as possible. We also don't want to have a million pieces. So I could maximize the space even more if I were to, let's say, cut this up into 20 pieces. Then it would fit a whole bunch of stuff there, but then my UV or my texturing would go slower. So this is a good amount of pieces here. So now I'm going to say that piece is done, and I'm just going to duplicate it and scoot it over. And I'll even give it a little bit of a rotation here. And then I'll duplicate that, scoot it over. Oh, have you guys seen this thing like that? Imagine those fit in there perfectly. Like, this is typically a picture you would see, like a motivational poster, where it would say, cooperation helps everyone, right? But this gear doesn't work. There's no way for me to turn this gear and have it turn this gear and have it turn that one, because they're all kind of locked together. So if this one, just so you can see, if this one turns this way, then that one would turn that way, causing this one to turn this way, but then this one's already turning the other way. It's weird how it's set up, but these things are all over. All right. So I won't do that. I'm just going to scoot this over. Nope, it was already cut. All I did was bevel it. That's it. All right, so let's say that this is good there. Okay, so there's my gears. So now what I'd want to do is I want to take this, and I don't want to relay out the UVs. All of my UVs are set up. They're all like perfectly lined up here. All I want to do is just offset each one of those 1 unit over. Okay? So this is my first one right here. I want to take the next one and move it over 1. Then take the next one and move it over 1. Then take the next one and move it over 1, and then take the next one and move it over 1. Okay? So I'm going to go to this one, grab all the pieces, and I want to move it literally 1 square over. Now, because we can't have any overlap or anything like that, like it can't be right here where it's covering this red line, I can manually move it. That's definitely a possibility. But it makes more sense to use that little box that we keep closing every time the UV editor opens. Or at least I close it. Okay, so these are some tools that we can use. One of them is transform. And if I set my move to 1 under transform and hit this, it just jumps it literally 1 shell over, or 1 square over. So I'm going to grab the next one, grab the pieces, and go 2 over. 1, 2. Now if you have a lot of pieces, this can get confusing. You just have to remember where the last one was. 1, 2, 3. And then grab the next one. 1, 2, 3, 4. Oops. So now if I were to grab all of my shells, pieces, there we go, you'll see they all have basically their own square. Now that was a lot quicker than doing a layout and having it lay out each piece. And it was definitely a lot quicker than, or a lot nicer looking than manually moving all the pieces around or anything like that. How'd they get weird?
Like they're all black now.
These ones? Did you hit 7?
I don't believe so.
Hit 6. Yeah, I'll take a look in a minute. Now we could also add other stuff to this too. So just so you see, let's say I do have a gear and I want it to look more like a gear. Typically there's something in the center of it that makes it look geary, like it's connected. So let's say I took this and grab these two pieces, I extrude it up, and grab these, extrude it out. Okay, so now it looks like something's actually like holding on to the gear itself. Same process, I'd lay out the UVs on this piece, I would add bevels, and then I would relay out the UVs, okay? Now if it works out good, I may be able to fit the UVs for both of these pieces inside of one square, okay? And that way, again, I'm kind of minimizing how many squares I have, but I'm also kind of maximizing my other stuff. Now, just like on the gaming stuff, if there's stuff that we don't see, like this inner piece, I can probably delete those faces out of there, okay? Just like we did on the stairs, we didn't see the back of the stairs at the bottom, we deleted it. We didn't see the back of our building, we deleted that. We could also delete faces in here that we don't see, okay? For now, I'm just going to keep this pretty simple without this thing in there, but I can always come back and adjust it. Now, here's the part that's going to be a bit different going forward with this. I'm still going to save this. I'm going to export my selection. FBX is a better way for us to be exporting from software to software, so I'm going to export it as an FBX every time now. So I'm going to export this as Gears 01 FBX. Okay. Now I didn't do any color shading on here, right? I didn't do anything like we did on the lampposts, so we have different ways to separate our materials. When I go into Substance, watch how this is going to come in. 20, production pipeline, scenes, gears. Oh, look at that. That's new. We are no longer using the Unreal setup. We're going to be using the PBR Metallic Roughness HQ. There it is. That means Photo-Based Realism Rendering Metallic Roughness HQ. I need to click on this Create a Texture Set per UDIM. This here, each one of these is a different UDIM. Okay, and what that means is that every one of my gears will have a different texture for it. So I go back to Substance. Everything else in here is cool. I just made sure that's checked. I made sure this is checked. I hit OK. So there's my gears. Here's this one. You'll notice that none of my other gears are going to show up in this area. They all show up here. Okay, so every time I switch this, it's switching to a different gear that I'm then coloring. So that means that as I texture stuff, I have to texture basically each one of my gears separately. So I'm going to do my bake texture. For the lecture, I'm going to keep this at 256. Still click this button. And then I could either bake 1001, which is the first one here, or I can say bake all of them. Okay, and so that's why I'm setting this so low, because when I hit bake all, it's going to do all of these maps and all the ones for this one, all the ones for that one, all the ones for this one, all the ones for that one. So as you get further into your texturing, you'll see that having 25 of these would take forever to do, because it would literally have to build texture maps for 25 items here, but all of these maps that it typically creates. That's where the production side of this is going to come in, because it's going to take that long for this thing to even calculate. You can see the first one is still going. Now I'm going to show you the texturing part of this, and then the rest of the class I'll let you work on creating these gears, bringing them into Substance, and then creating textures. Next class we'll go over how do we bring them back into Maya, how do we light them, render them out, and make it look nice, and then add some other features to it. All right? So that is all of them. So it brings all these in. You can see if I click through the list, each one of these now has their own texture. Smart materials, just to be quick with this one, I can drop on, where's my rusty metal? Actually do a silver armor, that's good. So I'll drop that on 1001. So when I drop it on this one, it's only texturing 1001, which is that one there. Okay, so it automatically separates these things. So when I want to put it on 2, I can right click and copy it. I can go to 2 and then just paste it, and then go to 3 and then paste, 4, paste, 5, paste. Oops, apparently 5 did not want to paste, and 4 didn't either. Come on. There we go. So I have my gears. They all have their own individual textures. If I paint anything, I go to a new layer, and then I paint. Now, just because this is on 1004, I have to use this as a way to help me see which one I'm painting. Because I can't paint this one, because that's not on 1004. I have to go over here, and then I can paint that one because that's on that texture. Okay? Other softwares, so this one, the Substance, this is how this one works. There's another software called Mari, which allows you to actually paint across different textures. So if I wanted to put a stripe going from here to there, Mari would allow me to do that. But Mari is limiting as to how those smart materials, it doesn't have those kinds of things. So we have to basically paint everything from scratch. But for this kind of work, it works awesome. When they did the Hulk, they did that in Mari. Very organic, very easy way to draw stuff. Even in ZBrush, they probably could use that too. Okay, so build some gears, lay out the UVs, put them in shells, export them, and bring them into Substance. You can also play with, if you want to add a little center to these, you can do that too. If you want to change their size, you can do that too. But just keep in mind that anytime you change the size of something, the UVs don't automatically scale, so these would need to have their UVs scaled down to fit. It will not do it automatically, so I scaled this one down. If I grab both of these, you can see how tiny these UVs are compared to that one. So what I have to do is I have to grab these UVs and scale them down manually until they match the other one. Because it doesn't matter if I scale it down, it still has to have uniform squares all over. Because otherwise what would happen is this gear would have a really crystal clear texture. This one would be a little bit murky. It'd be a little bit like fuzzy on the side. Now because this one's scaled down, let's say I'm still using that, if I were to duplicate it, well, I have more room inside this shell where I could just scoot that over. And so now these two are in the same shell, because they fit in the same shell. Same thing here and here. If I duplicated both of these like that, I could then put those there. And then when I create my textures, all of my textures for all of these things will have a uniform consistency to them. If one is high quality, the rest will be high quality too. Okay? It won't be like crystal clear and then really grainy, right? We don't want that. Okay? It doesn't matter if there's a space. So there's space, a space, and then this one, that doesn't matter either. As long as they are in these top right areas, that's all that matters. Now, for organizational purposes, keep them in order. Okay? So you do one row, and then you come up here and do another row, and then you would come up here and do another row, if you had that many. The more you have, the longer it's going to take to do all your texturing stuff. So for the first one, keep it simple. Just like we did the bat, the Negan bat. Yeah, Negan bat. Keep it simple. Model the gears, lay them out in separate pieces, export it out, bring it into Substance, and then just start playing with the texture there. All right? And then next class we'll go over bringing them back into Maya, rendering them out, and then what we do afterwards. Cool?